advocates and organizers talk about their work pushing for social, political, and policy change. It's my first episode back after a hiatus that went on too long, but this was a great discussion with a very insightful guest. You'll hear me recount the story of meeting Sarah Stachowiak, the CEO of Seattle-based evaluation consulting firm ORS Impact, because it was through her and her company that I first encountered the evaluation of advocacy efforts a field I joined just a couple of years later. But what I've always appreciated about ORS Impact is not only do they do great work for clients, but they provide vital thought leadership through the excellent studies and papers they publish on topics of broad interest to all of us who work in advocacy and the evaluation of advocacy. That's also why Sarah, who relates to advocacy as a social scientist and analyst, is the perfect guest for this podcast and had a lot of insight to share. The ORS Impact resources, and I encourage you to check out their website, delve into fascinating dimensions of social and policy change. Sarah and I talked about the challenges entailed when you try changing the deep-rooted narratives and assumptions that underlie the debates on so many issues. We talked about the trade-offs between seeking small incremental progress versus transformation of an unjust society. We talked about the problems with having a professional class of advocates and why marginalized communities should have a greater agenda-setting role. We talked about defensive advocacy and what organizers do during political tough times. And we concluded with a discussion of clearly defining terms in our field and why that's important. Today's guest has been an important role model for me here in the last phase of my career, and in that vein, she helped point the way for me to become an evaluation consultant. So I'll go ahead and tell how I first met ORS Impact CEO Sarah Stachowiak. 10 years ago, I had a half-time position with the Hewlett Foundation working remotely to wind down their grant making on nuclear weapons issues. This gave me many wonderful opportunities, but in relation to Sarah, I had the chance to commission evaluations and be the customer, and also to spend some time on site at the Hewlett offices where everyone's invited to sit in on any presentations taking place. Sarah's own visits to Menlo Park, working with other parts of the foundation, happened to coincide with mine twice, I believe. First time she was sharing results of ORS Impact's evaluations of a pair of K-12 education programs, and my then colleague and I needed evaluators to step in on a project that had gone a bit astray. The second time, Sarah was giving a presentation related to narrative framing and mentioned echo messaging as an indicator of success. Just to be clear, that's spelled ECHO, not messaging about the ecology, but instances when you hear the messages you've been putting out there echo back to you. So that's a good example and a good place to start the conversation. As an important leader in the field of evaluating social and policy change work, Sarah is steeped in what I'll call the epistemology of this work, what we can know about this endeavor and how we can know it. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
There are several major areas I'd like to explore with you since you and your colleagues have such a great overview. But let's start with the challenges of changing the narrative, which is basically the set of prevailing assumptions in any given issue area or societal problem. What have you and your colleagues found regarding that level of making change?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I'm happy to start on it. And, also I have lots of other colleagues at ORS Impact who think a lot about this and are very, very smart on the topic. Nikki Kalra, for example, is one who's done a lot of writing and thinking in this area. I think there's a variety of challenges that we have come across here. I mean, one is I think people are excited about the idea of narrative change and it feeling big and sometimes don't really know what it means and what it takes. So that's just, a not uncommon challenge of we'll get calls and we're like, is this narrative work? Are you really, trying to change these fundamental ways like people think about the world? And are you investing in ways that make that possible? I think because it can be kind of a diffuse and large scale and long time frame kind of approach to, there's also just the challenge of where would you see change? how can you know if it's working? Like, where do you look for evidence that progress is being made? That's not, suddenly we all think like deservingness is a different narrative, for example.
Right.
There's these kind of big efforts that are being.
Right. But you're right, of course. Making a dent in them, replacing them, puncturing them is super hard work.
Yeah. And I think they get entangled with like other approaches and strategies, even for people who want the same end. So when you were talking about that, I was thinking about a project we did with the foundation who was they were supporting advocacy, really wanted equity driven advocacy in states around safety net programs for families. And sometimes you have this, you don't want this narrative you need narratives of like people are deserving and people are good people. And sometimes the narrative to get a short-term policy win can be counter to your longer-term narrative strategy about like what the state should be doing and who deserves care versus this like, look at this poor downtrodden person, don't you want to help them? Right? Like that might help you in the moment, but be at odds at your longer-term strategy. So even though like I think some of that is the interesting wrestling that starts to happen.
Because it sets such a high bar for neediness that
Mhm.
everyone else back so, yeah, I can see that as a problem, sure.
Right. And so you can, I think a lot of times we see that with narrative and advocacy and policy change stuff of this tension between long-term goals and visions, short-term wins. We do some work with criminal justice transformation work in different kind of states and jurisdictions. And I have heard stories there of these tensions of, maybe you can get a short-term win that reduces sentences, keeps people out of jail in the first place, gets people out of jail faster, right? And is that the calculus of like, you get a win, the win makes some difference, it makes a small difference in the scale of the problem. Does that little win take the political pressure off of people who want a bigger win? Because now you have politicians whose calculus is like, well, I gave you something, now leave me alone for a while. And, some of those wins might come at the expense of bigger messaging, right? About what we think about incarceration, carceral state,
Right.
State's role, violence, community safety, all those things.
This makes me think about some of the returning citizens issues and the work done around restoring voting rights to
Mm-hmm.
convicted felons. I gather that what they were trying to connect with in voters, because in Florida, maybe other places, but notably in Florida, was put on the ballot, was that they understood that the public was sympathetic to the idea of second chance starting over. But it doesn't exactly go right at the carceral society, does it?
Right. Yeah, we heard that a little bit with especially some of the states in the South. There's the religious messaging and frames and narratives that people hold. I think one of the challenges is like it keeps it as an individual problem and not a systemic problem, right?
Mm.
You're an individual person who's done something wrong, who's paid their debt, who is or is not now worthy of forgiveness and redemption versus like we have a whole system that catches people up and like in a racist way, in a way that like doesn't that has a lot of harm. And so like that frame, right? So you could lean into that frame to maybe get some wins, but it also like does a disservice to other challenges that are in place.
Right. That what you bring up about individual stories speaks to a much bigger problem of having to do with the power of a narrative. And we
Mm,
all know at that brain level that stories connect with people. At the same time, we know that, particularly as people who like to, look for evidence and take evidence seriously, and that resonance of individual stories is just destructive, right? Because it overshadows and overwhelms every important piece of, larger data points, like you're saying, about society, about systems. I guess that's a meta narrative problem, not a problem with meta narratives, but a meta problem with narratives overall, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think, that feels to me like probably one of the reasons it's become maybe a more popular strategy in the last few years is I do think, well, many of us would love to believe that data and research are compelling in the answer. I think that's not been proven. There's lots of things we know. We know lots of things about the climate. We're not behaving differently. We're not making
Yeah.
policies, based on facts and data and science. And so probably some of this desire is like, how do we tap into that? Like you're saying, like very human desire to feel connected to stories and um, how do we do that thoughtfully and use think about what the framing, the people, the words, the like all the things that go into kind of like what you're putting out in the world, like how it can support or hinder your efforts in a different way than maybe people were thinking about before.
So that sounds like an argument for not going against the neurological tendency to latch on to stories, accept that reality, and, well, try and tell stories about data, I guess.
Yes. Trust me, I'm not going to sit here and argue against data and research, although it has its own flaws. It's a human endeavor, right? It is imperfect as well, but
And it's aligned with
right.
evidence, I suppose, right?
Mm-hmm.
On one of the other podcasts, I want to loop back to what you were talking about earlier about difficult choices and trade-offs.
Mm.
So as you pick a battle, to coin a phrase, um, and that choice carries potential problems, like working within the status quo narrative. The podcast I did with Elisa Massimino, human rights advocate, she brought up the very interesting problem of slicing out a piece of the problem that seems to imply that the other parts of the problem are not as bad. So, death penalty, use of the death penalty for people convicted while they were minors. If you go at that, is there some implication that it's legit to use capital punishment for adults? And it seems like you actually can avoid some of those implications, I think. But her experience was that it didn't come back to bite you. What it did was it just injected life into a moribund debate.
Mm.
I don't know. It'd be interesting to get your perspective on that because it probably comes up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I think, I mean, the first thing I think about is one of the reasons I love doing this work with advocacy and narrative and all these changes. I find the people doing it are very brilliant and creative, very fun to work with, right? Like how they think about these problems. Because I think I tend to bring more of the lens of like, well, what hypothesis are you testing? How would you know? What's the basis for that, assumption? How might you see if this is working in the ways that you want? I think, there's all kinds and when I think about advocates and theories of change, a lot of times it's not so much that they, in the course of a campaign or an effort on an issue, change how they think change is going to happen. It's a lot more in the tactics, right? Like, what is that messaging that's working? Who are the targets? Who are the right people right now? Like, how who are the right messengers, right? Like those are a lot of the things that happen versus like a fundamentally changed idea about how change is going to happen. So yeah. And I think I think there's just an inevitable, the frames are so, I mean, we live in the United States. We are a nation built on slavery and capitalism and colonialism and all kinds of things that the narratives and mindsets that are harmful are extremely deep. And it is going to be big and hard and long work to fundamentally change those. So it just seems almost unavoidable that you're going to not, it's hard to give up any wins in the absence of like fundamentally changing kind of the character of the United States. So it makes sense that these kind of calculations are underway. I think what feels heartening though is at least the mindfulness of what are the trade-offs you're making and what might, so like if I think about that case of juveniles and death penalty, it could be that that's a thing that helps you make a positive change. I am a strong person who does not believe in the death penalty. I'm like, anything you could do to not get the state killing people, is something that is worthwhile in my books. And, it's still sort of feeding into this thing that some lives are more worthy than others, right? Like, so like if you really kind of start thinking like, what are these narratives that we're saying and who's worthy of care and kindness and how do we understand the context and situations people are in, it doesn't change that. But like, I don't know, maybe I'm talking myself into it. Like we got to work on it and be mindful of it. And you almost can't not bump into them. Sorry, I'm taking a class about decolonization. So I'm really deep in the thinking about all these things right now.
So there's a lot in there. I don't want to lose what you were saying before, if only to just sort of echo it.
Yep.
It sounded like that what you run across is that there tends to be a sticking with some of those key assessments, strategy versus tactics. You were saying before that there more refinements take place than going back on assumptions. I thought that was interesting in itself. But what you've been talking about here in terms of the systemic problems in a country built on racism also seems to me speak to the broader issue of the relationship between incrementalism and ambition. In our field broadly, we're becoming more and more aware that the most meaningful, the most significant changes happen when numbers of people are mobilized, when you're really organizing, right? And that's it's labor intensive, it's time intensive, it's not easy to do, and you can only do it so much, right? So many people to try and make a claim on time. And more and more I've been thinking that, kind of two things can be true, that yes, over time, that's how you get more. And that what incrementalism is kind of what you can get in the meanwhile and is probably worth going for. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you brought it to those concepts of like incrementalism and transformation. I mean, I think about there's the theory that change happens in these punctuated equilibriums, right? So we're kind of steady state, make a big jump versus like steady incrementalism is going to add up to big change. And I think that's an interesting thing where there's some of this of like, how do I want to say this? I think the people most affected, I have sometimes heard be very impatient with this incrementalism argument, because is it really going to accrue to anything? Is it getting us to the punctuated equilibrium? Is it just making things a little bit better that assuages things and makes it harder to like keep going. So I think there's something in there about who's getting to decide the strategy, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yes,
is incrementalism
yes,
sufficient,
yes.
appropriate? Should we be keeping that energy going and letting the problem fester such that like it forces a different, bigger jump? You know, and obviously people have different stakes in that and think about it differently.
Point very well taken. Uh, some of the reading I've been doing lately talks about some of the problems that go with the professionalization of advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a white guy who made his living off of that professionalization. And it's completely persuasive that in terms of picking the items for the agenda that affected people and marginalized people, need much bigger voices in that. In the same literature, I am also noticing acknowledgement of that the inside game stuff, what I call what you can get without having to mobilize a lot of people, that's still a thing. I'll put it that way. And one discussion I really be interested in connecting to more wherever it's taking place is exactly that, right? So how can knowledge about the incrementalist game have a good connection to a new way of organizing?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the danger is probably falling into the trap of like either or thinking, right? It's either professional and white and exclusive, or it is community driven and, you know, by the people most affected. And it feels like, we are in the current world. There are people who have
Right.
more access than others. And, how are those who are in that professional space listening? I'm hesitant to use being the word ally. I have a friend, Aparna Ray, who just wrote a great LinkedIn thing about allyship and the dangers of like who gets to call themselves an ally. Allyship doesn't seem to be making a whole lot of change in the world. But like, are there ways in which there are people with different amounts of access and influence, and how do you? It doesn't feel like you can try and mitigate that over time, and you can try and use it for good. Within the context that we currently exist in, right?
I mean, I guess the question would be, if I tried to sum it up, in engagement with affected and marginalized communities, looking together at, what smaller pieces might have the most value. All this discussion of transformation and what's achievable is a good segue to another thing I very much wanted to talk about, and your firm ORS Impact has been studying lately. It's under the heading of defensive advocacy. It's called that because sometimes the best you can get is not actually winning some steps forward. So sometimes you've done good and protected people often by keeping bad things from being worse. What really interests me is that really puts it in context, I think, right? If this work doesn't take place in a vacuum. It takes place in the context of the system that's accrued, and also the politics such as they are. So I'd love to, have you talk about what you found interesting about that sort of study of defensive advocacy.
Yeah, it's making me smile to remember doing that work because I think, we talked to some amazing advocates at the time. I'm trying to remember who all there's probably Jen Lamson and Charmaine Mercer and Lisa Klein, and I'm not going to remember all the people, women I really admire. And it was one of those things where it's like, well, duh, advocates have been doing this all along. Evaluators are kind of catching up to the real reality of the world. And I think what was super interesting about that is, to your comment about winning the loss, I think we were thinking a lot about the defense is like you're trying to stop something bad from happening, right? Which is a piece of it, but it's only a piece of it. There's the, can you ameliorate the harm? Like, can you win the loss, right? You're going to lose, but could you lose less badly, have less negative impacts for people? I think the most surprising piece of it from the outside, probably not surprising to advocates at all, was like kind of this idea of the proactive defense, which sounds like a contradiction of terms, but also reminds me some of what we've been talking about like how are you making sure that like you are thinking about the narratives and relationships and the champions and all these things like in a long-term way so that you are less likely to have to be on defense in some ways. um, so I think that was really interesting. I mean, the other thing that's a little bit funny to think about, the work came about because we went to a conference. I was at a conference for the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, and I'd been asked to come and talk about measuring and evaluating advocacy and policy change in November 2016. And I mean, like, very soon after the election, and all the advocates were looking at me like, why are you talking to me about policy wins? This is not going to be our reality for the next 4 years. Like, I don't even want to have this conversation with you. This is ridiculous. And I was like, ooh, okay, we have something to do here. Because yes, you're going to be busy, but not in the same way. So it also was nice to be able to kind of hear that and hear how advocates really did think about their work and do their work. I think the other thing I really love about advocacy is that relates to this point is there are these moments, right? There's legislative sessions, there's these particular policy windows that are known, but advocates don't, it's hard to get an advocate to be like, oh yes, we won or lost in a way, because they're always thinking about what's the next opportunity. So I had heard about this idea of finite and infinite games from Glenda Eo Yang and the Human Systems Dynamic Institute. And so a finite game is like a soccer game. You have rules, you have a referee, happens for a set amount of time, you have a winner or loser at the end, mostly. Infinite games are like life, right? Who decides who wins or loses? You don't know when the start and the end times are. Lots of people can decide what wins and losses mean. And so that orientation to thinking about it is always interesting as an evaluator, because I think it's people don't ever, I think, really think it's totally done, right? They're always thinking about what's next, what might happen, what's the next opportunity, what's the next further thing. If we didn't get it enough, or we didn't get it this time, the next time is coming. So I think that fits into that just defensive advocacy idea.
So what are the implications of that sort of ongoing feedback loop for evaluation? I mean, I guess it has to do with learning, which is exactly what evaluation is about.
Yep. Yeah. Advocates really want good information if you don't waste their time. They don't have a lot of patience for time wasting, but if you have something for them, they want it.
I mean, there is a perfect example, but if we think about the highlight of the Trump years, it had to have been when Senator McCain was the vote that preserved the Affordable Care Act. There's your defensive advocacy, and indeed, I mean, Move On, I think, was at the center of a huge coalition that worked on that.
Yeah, and it's interesting from an evaluation point of view too, because sometimes people can't and don't want to, and it is politically inexpedient to take credit for things that are really important in making things happen, right? sometimes you need it to look like someone was the winner and the driver, because that's their win, right? Is having that position, even if other people were involved and other things were happening. So, you know.
I am a politician, so I can't plead innocence to ever try, claiming credit. I do try and be scrupulous about what I'm claiming. We've been talking about advocates, but I wanted to, because you and your work connect a great deal with philanthropy and foundations in terms of who needs to be more aware of these range of possibilities. It's not the practitioner's audience, it's not the grant recipients who need to be more clued into that, is it? It's the grant makers. And what, have you had any interesting encounters in terms of opening eyes on that side of things?
Yeah.
And having funders be, better clued into some of that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, probably I have a funny point of view because we do this work. We're hired by people who better understand this work than others. So I think, most of our experiences and I think where we see the most challenge for people is boards have a lot of power and don't often really understand. And often both want success to be measured in concrete wins, which is not always, is important, right? Like, yes, you need to get there. And sometimes the opportunities change. Sometimes what you could still be making progress without that. Sometimes you can't make progress there for reasons that you just are not in your control. And I think maybe undervalue some of the adaptive capacity you need on hand to be able to take advantage of opportunity as they come about. So maybe some impatience of understanding timeframes that come about. And I think the other thing we're increasingly running into, interestingly, is it feels like foundations have taken a step back in their fears of being called lobbyists. And I'm seeing a lot more conservatism around foundations' willingness to talk about what is legally okay in their remit to do around advocacy, and seeming to get a little bit more cold feet at times around fear of being accused of lobbying. So that's a little bit of cold water that is sometimes feeling a little bit new, even of people with whom I hadn't had that that kind of conversation before. Talking a lot more to legal departments. A lot more things reviewed by foundation lawyers than I think was always true. So I think, it's sort of the fear of lobbying, understanding of timeframes, maybe unwillingness or underappreciation of the value of investing in infrastructure and adaptive capacity, and kind of counting policy wins as the thing, right? Because we also know you could get policy wins that don't have the intended impact. The policy win may not be the thing, even if you think it's the thing. So, there's also that. So it can be sometimes either quite narrow view. But again, I feel like there's a lot more boards.
This has been an ongoing question, hasn't it, of foundations, and your point is well taken that the foundations that you know best or that I might know best tend to be the ones who are not as skittish, but many are skittish about getting involved in issues where it's going to feel like getting political or taking a side, or, as you say, crossing the line on tax law, which, for those who aren't familiar, kicks in anytime that you're talking about something that is headed towards coming up to be voted on. And everything else is fair game, which means that a huge amount in the executive branch is nowhere close to that legal line.
Yeah. 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 I don't know if it's, all the recent attacks about, race stuff and quotas and, more lawsuits around racial priorities and such that's kind of making people get some worry about other things that could be up for kind of public debate. I don't know. I don't know where it's coming from, but it definitely feels different in the last year or two than I think I'd experienced before that.
And there's an asymmetry, isn't there? I'm not involved in the Koch brothers network. I have never been to any of the meetings. But my spidey sense says they don't really get hung up too much on whether something will be seen as political.
Yes. Oh, that was the other thing I wanted to say about the challenges in philanthropy, though, is I think sometimes too much desire to do the thing that's novel or be able to say, like, this happened because of us, like the contribution attribution kinds of questions, when, like, one of my colleagues, I think advocacy is a team sport. There's so many
Can't
things
do anything
all
alone.
contextually driven. And I think getting overly hung up on, like, wanting to either do things for which you feel like you can more uniquely take credit, or that sort of being such a key question also feels a little counterproductive at times.
Another area that you and your colleagues have been looking into that I'd be curious to hear more about is field building.
Mm-hmm.
A few years ago, I had an evaluation project of a congressional fellowship program that placed technologists into congressional offices. And the bigger context of that was building the field of public interest tech, public interest technology, analogous to public interest law. What have been some of the interesting things that have been looked into or learned about field building?
Yeah, it is a really interesting area. We got involved in it in part because we were finding people wanting to call a lot of things movements, social movements that were not movements, um, which has some harms of its own, with co-optation or gentrification of movements or movement capture by philanthropy. And so part of our work came about of hearing people who were like, you are not building a movement, so what are you doing? And a few times it was field building, right? So the things they had in common is, like, you want large scale impact, you're trying to build kind of this infrastructure, you want to have impact beyond, the time of a kind of a specific investment. And so we entered it in that way, and do some work with Fund for Shared Insight, which has been trying to build a field around feedback, collecting and listening to feedback from people who are being served by foundations and nonprofits and who are usually least consulted on what they actually need and want. And it's kind of gone into other areas. And, I think we learned a lot from some work that came out of Bridgespan they've developed a strong field framework. So really defining what are core elements of a field. So how do you think about what is the identity of a field? There's sort of standards and practices. There's evidence-based. There's what kind of support do you have among leaders and grassroots? What's the funding situation? I think there's one more. I should have it memorized. But, kind of these different facets. I think what we've been able to do since then is both, like, how do you think about measuring those things and the status of a field? And how do you think about, and we pulled from other researchers to think about, there's sort of stages of field development. So yes, you have these elements, but what do these elements mean altogether? So there's, emerging field, a maturing field, and kind of thinking about those stages of maturation relative to those different components. I think, like our earlier conversation about narrative, I feel like fields are now the term du jour, that everybody wants to be building fields, and not everything is a field. feel like I spent a lot of time telling people like this thing you're saying might not be exactly what you mean.
So
Because
you're
I think
like, here you are, you start out because there's the idea of a movement is
right.
squishy and overused, and you go over here and find eventually the same thing happening.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, one thing that's kind of fun about it is like almost everybody is kind of part of some kind of fields, right? Most people I talk to, if you're in evaluation, you're in a field. If you're in philanthropy, you're in a field. And then you have sort of subfields. And how do you think about, we have people who are doing some work around civic science that's kind of trying to bridge things from lots of different fields. Is it its own thing? Are you trying to embed it into existing fields? Are you really trying to create a new field? So, yeah, I mean, I think at the heart of it, for me in my work with this, right, like it's not the desire to be like the language police or be like overly precise or have false precision. And I think what I see happen, I mean, humans and language is like so imperfect forms of communication. But if we can use words that mean things and mean the same thing, like the likelihood of having some of this desired impact and positive social impact is better if we're all, more or less talking off of the same page versus like we're in like totally different parts of the room and can't even agree on what we're talking about. So I think while it can start like what I never want in these conversations is it just feels very like pedantic and academic, right? The practical side of it is like, let's try and be clear. How do we have the strongest, strategy and set of hypotheses possible? How do we make sure if you're working with an evaluator, you're measuring things that matter and will tell you something that's useful? So, I think that's where some of the theory and terminology is important, right? It's just that clarity and alignment.
It is. Being clear about words is being clear about concepts and categories and distinctions. And I said it in the introduction to the episode that the resources that ORS Impact puts out are really very, very helpful. It's a resource base for the field. And it's funny that we're talking about this because just today, I'm now going to have to make a change because the thing that I've always called leverage, you call influence. For valid reasons, the work in that area, you've tagged leverage to connected it with resources mobilized. And I, whenever I've talked about kind of picking battles, I've always talked about, well, what's the leverage over that decision point or those decision makers or that decision. So now I'll change to influence. But this has really been great. I'm so grateful to you for this conversation and for the work that you've done more generally. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, David. It's been lots of fun.